welcome to the show. Mystery Go and the Feral Monk are back. Welcome to season 2. We're kicking it off with an introductory podcast on yoga today. And I've got Mr. Monk with me from Switzerland, and it's good to have you back, sir.
It's good to be back. Excited for season 2.
Most definitely. So, as I pull up some of my notes here, I'll kick it off by saying that I have been in yoga school for the past couple of months, and I've thoroughly enjoyed that. It's been a little bit daunting of an experience doing it online. I think it's been very challenging. With COVID, it's just not really practical to be able to do yoga hands-on in a studio setting. So I think I've tried to pick up this at a difficult point in yoga's evolution. But I believe that, that was also one of the reasons why it kind of attracted me also, was to be able to utilize some of the wonderful benefits that yoga and like mindfulness and meditation has provided me during this time, to be able to do that online and with a supportive online community, I think is very powerful. So, and it just so happens that Mr. Monk has got extensive experience on this subject. And perhaps you'd like to lead us in this discussion on an intro to yoga, Mr. Monk.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I've been fascinated with yoga, and I've been studying it and diving deep into it. At certain points in the beginning, I maybe got into almost a traditionalist kind of mindset with yoga. There were certain traditions that I thought were authentic, and others, I considered others to be less authentic or not authentic. Over time, I've come to appreciate a wider view on yoga and the history of it and how it's developed and those types of things. But it's been a 26-year love affair to date. So I've lived in India twice and studied with some of the senior Iyengar teachers, as well as some of the senior Ashtanga Vinyasa teachers from Patipa Joyce. And just really delved into it. We lived in Rishikesh and in South India. So there's two very marked places for the development of what we think of as yoga today. So just to touch on that just quickly, in southern India, there was a man named Tirumalai Krishnamacharya. And though a lot of people don't know his name, he's sort of responsible for most of the teachers we think of today and most of the styles of asana practice that we think of today. So Indra Devi and his son Desikachar and B.K.S. Iyengar and Patipa Joyce were all students of his at some point. And so the Ashtanga Vinyasa style, which later also evolved into power yoga and Vinyasa flow, Iyengar yoga, which developed into various offshoots. What it's most known for is the creation of props to allow difficult poses to be more accessible to people who don't maybe have the physical capacity to reach the full position, so they can still derive the therapeutic benefits from it. Indra Devi took the traditional yoga that she learned from Krishnamacharya more into sort of the Latin American world, and did a lot of teaching in Spanish. But she was one of the first teachers that he sent out, and it's a real, I don't know what you would say, a real tribute to the flexibility of yoga at a time when, because of religious restrictions, it was not deemed suitable for women, and much less that women would become teachers. Here, this great yogi of the last century chose as one of his first teachers to the West, a woman, a Western woman at that. And there's something to be said about that openness in yoga to adapt and to take on new practices and to eliminate practices that aren't working. And we'll touch on more on that in just a second. The northern end of it, what we see a lot of yoga today, comes between the Shivananda and the Bihar school of yoga. And that's more towards the northern part of India. They have a more, I would say, a more Hindu rooted version of yoga. And it's not to say that those Hindu elements aren't present in Krishnamacharya's. His just tend to be a little more focused on practicality,
Right.
and therapeutics and stuff like that. But out of that whole northern school, you have Shivananda, you have the Bihar school of yoga, you have Devananda, and you have Satchitananda. Satchitananda, whenever he came to New York, he sort of helped pioneer, at least inspire and prompt to study yoga's effect on the organs. And that's where we sort of get the first studies about its ability to reduce blood pressure. And so a lot of these sort of yogic physical claims were starting to be proven in sort of a more Western scientific setting.
Right.
And so out of all of that is a lot of what we know about yoga. Now, the thing about it is that, I mean, it's uncountable numbers of traditions of yoga. Yoga is something that you'll hear like these numbers thrown around, like it's 5,000 years old, it's 10,000 years old, it's 30,000 years old, it's whatever, and a lot of times those things are based on different sources. They might be mythological, they might be archaeological, they might be inferences. I would tend to think that there's a difference between the actual cultural manifestation of yoga in the Indian subcontinent and what yoga actually is. I mean, we have other words in our language like shaman, which comes from a very specific tribe, and it's the word for medicine man. But we've come to take that word now and we mean all medicine men. So we might talk about tribes that didn't have shamans as a word. They had a different word for it in their own language.
Mm-hmm.
What's a little bit interesting about yoga is it keeps the same name, even as it's transferred over into Western. Not always with the poses, but even there are a lot of currents in modern day yoga that are also trying to keep the Sanskrit names alive,
Yeah.
understanding where they come from and what they mean. So
I think that's one of the fascinating things that I've been learning about yoga is that it draws on so many different religions from different parts of the world. And usually our conception of yoga is just from India, right?
yeah, I think in the modern day, especially if like you're a completely new student. I mean, whenever you first decided to get into yoga, I mean, you had certain reasons to do it. Whenever I first got started with yoga, it was because my girlfriend thought the yoga teacher was super hot, and I was jealous of that. And I was like, I'm going to do yoga better than this guy. So it was very selfish,
Ego driven.
serendipitous thing that sort of pulled me into it.
Yeah.
But then the hero's journey begins after such moments.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, I also had images more of like what you might call more of like fakirs, like people who are doing these kinds of tricks and things in the public squares and streets for money, more of like a street art and things of that nature. Or I would have more of the image of it as a class that like girls go to do sports class,
Yeah.
like I didn't have like a whole lot of images about it whenever I got into it. And whenever I first got into it, I tended to stick with the tradition that I was encountering right then. And at some point I realized in looking up these texts and looking up like these different traditions and things, I realized, oh, there's an insane amount of yoga traditions. There's yoga traditions where, for example, like the Agori Babas, that are drinking and eating out of real human skulls, and they cover their bodies in real human ashes from the funeral pyres. And they have a more tantric or more left hand yogic path, which means they tend to allow a lot, they tend to indulge a lot, as opposed to the right hand side of the yoga path, which would be more disciplined and trying to be virtuous and these types of things. And so I realized, oh, there's an entire world there, and what I had come to understand as yoga in the West was a far deeper rabbit hole with much more complexity and nuance and than I'd ever expected. And so that's where the fascination began. And I would say it actually ended up in an over fascination on the differences between the traditions and cultures, instead of the question that now 26 years later in my practice would have been the best question in the beginning was, what is this all about? What am I really doing here with this? Like, why am I doing it? And what is it exactly that I'm doing? I don't know if you had similar experiences whenever you got started or not, but that was for me like a very typical beginning, and I've seen it since then in a lot of like the classes and stuff. Students also have sort of a similar situation where they had a certain image or a certain idea about it, that we see from the sort of the Hollywood version of modern yoga, with these dramatic spiritual scenes and this beautiful Indian music, and we're trying to create moods and feelings and things out of that, sort of romanticizing this ancient holy man. And
I totally had misconceptions for sure about it, because it's such a vast umbrella, right, of different things. But yeah, one of the most interesting things that I did find out early on, was looking into the sutras, the Yoga Sutras, and they're one of the most, the ancient texts, and how they didn't really focus on the poses, the asanas. And so that kind of contradicted what my major perception of what yoga was that it was mostly, exercise, skinny Indian guys, really flexible, like crazy circus style. Yeah.
So, but it's good that you bring up the Yoga Sutras, because actually that would be probably the single most modern referenced yogic text for the styles of yoga that we have today. And it is true that asana in its original meaning is basically just a seat. So it's your seated posture that you're doing your breathing and meditation and other exercises in. So the seat or the asana is described as sukha, and sukha is easy. So it has to be easy, and it has to be steady. And those are the only instructions in Patanjali's treatise on what asana is a comfortable, steady pose in which to meditate in. And so the asana phenomenon that we think of today as like postures, these different postures, develops more out of other traditions. And it's I mean, we can kind of go back to sort of like the what would in the European side would be like the Renaissance time period, and you can find some text maybe between like the 11th to like the 1700s. That time period is sort of where this type of yoga, hatha or gata, there's a couple of different traditions that developed in that time period. And so we get certain texts from that time period where they're describing postures in a more detailed way, and they tend to resemble more what we recognize today. But even then, in those books, you're talking about maybe 32 postures, or like in the Shiva Samhita, it's said that there are as many postures as there are beings in the universe. And so they posit, literally billions of postures, but 84 were meant for mankind. And so because of this little like mysterious illusion during that time period, there's a whole section of the yoga family that believes that Shiva, as God, gave mankind 84 poses that are beneficial for them. And so which are those 84 poses is a completely different conversation. There's no definitive, clear answers to that. The only tradition today that plays on that number of 84 poses is actually Bikram. And that's a whole can of worms to open up right there. That's a troubled tradition, especially in the last while, being rocked with sexual abuse scandals and
Yes.
and stuff like that. But it comes out of like an emerging body culture that was kind of like yoga bodybuilding in sort of a way.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, not completely, but more so than the other yogas.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hot yoga, all that kind of stuff comes out of that whole family of development.
Insane, all the different kinds of yoga that there are.
Which is pretty confusing for a new student, Like you want to start doing yoga because you hear about it, you hear people's testimonies, how it's really changed their life, or it's helped them to deal with certain things, stress, whatever the case may be in their life. They feel lighter, they feel healthier, they feel more active and agile. And so you hear all of these things, and then so you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go take a class. And then you've opened up the rabbit hole. Which class are you going to go to? You're going to go to Anusara yoga? You're going to go to Bhakti yoga class? Or you're going to go to a Hatha yoga class? Or you're going to go to a Shivananda Hatha yoga class, or a Vinyasa flow Hatha class? Or you're going to go to an Ashtanga Vinyasa class? Or you're going to go to an Iyengar class? And it sort of leaves the beginning student with sort of the feeling of, well, which one's right, and which one's going to work, which one's going to actually do for me what I want it to do, and so, if I would like to offer this, like for people who are listening to the podcast, you're thinking about getting started in yoga, or you're sort of at the beginning, it seems a little overwhelming or a little bit confusing. I would like to kind of, for example, since we're going to be confronted with traditions mostly based on the Yoga Sutras, I thought it would be a good idea if we sort of developed a little bit of an understanding about what the Yoga Sutras are, and also touch on what do we even mean with yoga. I mean, there are people out there who've over the decades have always, in the beginning of the yoga book, there's a what is yoga chapter. And in there's always like a definition, and most people take like the definition that has been given in every other book. So like yoga as a word comes from like the Sanskrit root yuj, and it basically has to do with using, as a use and application. It has to do with uniting things or connecting things. It has to do with communion. It's implied in the uniting of things, the uniting of all things, including your soul back to God. And so there's these implications from the word itself. And it's actually the literally where our word for yoke comes from in the English language. So there's this Indo-European language family, and Sanskrit is one of the older siblings of all of those Indo-European languages that develop.
Yeah.
But knowing the definition of the word, use and apply what? Unite what to what? Connect what to what? Like there's
what's being yoked.
What's being yoked? And what am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah.
And so for me, like I've come to a point in my practice and in my reading and everything where for me, yoga it's like a a general framework, almost like a structure by which you can organize. It's like an organizational structure by which you can organize different types of techniques. And all those techniques are generally goal-oriented techniques. They're not pleasure-oriented techniques. And so it becomes sort of like an organizational structure for the individual's journey in their spiritual development. It's giving like the ultimate freedom to each individual in the sense that, hey, you can search out and explore your physical body, your mind, your breath, and your spirit for yourself. You don't have to take people's secondhand information. You don't have to whatever. And in that whole series of techniques, there are also techniques to help check yourself. So you're not just creating a fantasy for yourself, or you're just lying to yourself, or whatever, creating a comfortable mythology to live inside of. And that's not the point of it. The point of it is saying, okay, I've got this self-aware consciousness. It's a really mysterious thing. It's crazy. Why do I have it? Why doesn't that thing ever seem to age? Why doesn't it seem to have like a weight or a space or a location? It's a very interesting phenomenon, just consciousness. And I have this body and I have this mind, you know, that's sometimes very helpful and sometimes very annoying. And so what is all that? And like, how do I go about finding out what all that is? You know, I need some tools to explore with, and some ideas to work with, and to test out, and to find out whether they're working truths or not. Trying to find out an absolute truth about something is a waste of time. But if you can find good, positive working truths for yourself, then you're going to make progress in that journey.
Yep.
And the Yoga Sutras is just a structure that's already very nicely developed. So, you know, I don't know if maybe you want to go into the Yoga Sutras, or if you have a.
Yeah, I mean, I just had a question. So out of that, basically, is what we get from Patanjali and the 8 limbs of yoga.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well,
then,
what everyone is so
also,
familiar with.
one that's basically. And then there's also, you know, supplementary texts like the Vedas and the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita. And so all of these are yogic texts from different religions. But basically, kind of like you were saying with yoga, it's like it's unique in that it's all, you know, it doesn't change. It's still the same, right?
Yeah, well, it's in the sense that it still carries the same name.
Yes, yeah.
Like it still carries the same reference name, sort of like like the shaman effect.
That's what, yeah.
You know, but yoga has come to mean that broader umbrella under which we put spiritual techniques and technologies and philosophies to organize them, you know, for our own spiritual development.
Yeah.
Instead of having an external source. And even in the traditions of yoga, there's the guru and the sisya. There's the teacher who is gu, and dru is removing darkness. And it's mostly just a very intimate, close relationship with somebody who's a little bit further along the path than you are, and helps you to maybe come to discover or recognize certain things that are beneficial to your development as well, you know, that you have to still make your own. You still have to make them your own. But so maybe we touch a little bit on the Yoga Sutras.
Absolutely, yeah. So
that we have, like, you know, sort of an idea of, you're going to encounter this mostly in most of the traditions. Yeah. So maybe if putting them into perspective, and something fell down.
Interesting things going on my desk here. Weird.
Yeah, but I was thinking we could touch on the Yoga Sutras and sort of look at the Yoga Sutras through that lens, that as an organizational structure with certain elements already in place for us to develop off of.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about like starting off with like the yamas.
Exactly. Like, I mean, we can think of it as in a couple of ways. So you have the 8 petals, and there's or the 8-limbed path, or whatever you want to call it. and basically it's going to go through, so we can think of it in a couple of ways. It's sort of like a series of stages that sort of denote certain attainments of the journey. And it can also be sort of like almost like a scale. It could also be vertically thought of more of like a ladder.
Right.
So you have certain things that are absolutely basic and need to be taken care of first before you can come up the next rung on the journey. To touch on the stages effect, it's basically moving you through moral actions and disciplines into the exploration of the body, into the exploration of the breath, into the exploration of the mind and the senses, into deep concentration, meditation, and eventual liberation from the more automatic or biological impulses and things that can tend to drive our personalities, our emotions, and our unconscious actions. And so there would be sort of like stages that you would hit. At the same time, on the latter form of it, you could think of it as the yamas and the niyamas. That's the bare basics that if you're on a spiritual path and you want to be, to develop yourself into a more ethical person through that, and a more spiritual person, you're going to have to cover the yamas and the niyamas. You're going to have to cover some type of basic moral disciplinary code to give yourself direction. It's not meant to be a dogma that completely closes you in. Right. Like we have this tendency in the West afterwards to, do something wrong. We tend to beat ourselves, like the Gregorians. And
flatulation.
But we don't, it's not necessary. So you need to start at those bare basics. And then after you've got those bare basics, you might be like, okay, well, how do I develop that further? Like, how do I, okay, I understand, like, my actions are pretty much wholesome now. I'm not hurting others or creating sort of bad situations around me or in my family or myself and my community. But what's more there? And so after that, yamas and niyamas, then you're at the third stage or step or rung or whatever you want to call it. And then you're at asana. And why not make this term as big as it is today, to include all of those postures. But let's not think of them necessarily as like a means or just purely a therapeutic means to physical health, but more of like a series of possibilities to explore what the body is and what it can do. Allowing consciousness to fully experience what physicality is like. Why else would a spirit incarnate physically if not for the experience that it's incarnating into?
Good point.
Excuse me. And so once you've explored the body then long enough, you might notice that there's this chattering thing going on inside your skull cavity, or you might notice that okay, I've I can do all the poses perfectly now, but I'm still not enlightened, or I'm still not a nice person, or I'm still, like I'm still not there. So, or maybe you are all those things, but you still need to go a step further. Then you would be moving into pranayam. Right. And pranayam is one of those Sanskrit words that's also a little bit difficult because you have these sort of like these ways to combine Sanskrit words. So pranayama could be prana yama, and then it would be like the discipline of the breath. It would be like to discipline the breath. It would be all of those different exercises that everyone thinks of with breathing exercises in yoga, whether it's the fast diaphragmatic breathing, or whether it's through one nostril and then the other, or whether it's, whatever that might be. Those would sort of fall under like breathing disciplines. Mm-hmm. There's another way that word could be understood, and that would be pranayama, and that would be breath undisciplined. So it would be natural breath. And why would you want to do that? Well, there would be benefits to not, if you're trying to see things as they are, then you're also for that moment trying to relinquish your control over things. So you can let them be as they are, so that you can see them. And so that is going to be that undisciplined breath is going to be a great meditation aid in the long run.
Yeah.
And the disciplined breath is going to give you a tool, because the breath has a foot in each world, in the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems. If you want to, you can breathe how you want. If you don't do anything at all, it goes on its own. So it's touching both nervous systems. And so it's sort of like a bridge between like the physicality of our experience and the mentality of our experience. And so you might use disciplined breath to influence your mental state, to calm it down, to get it, into a certain level of concentration or whatever. And so pranayama is like another deeper exploration. You're starting to cross over that physicality into the psychological, into that aspect of our experience. And so once you get over into that mental aspect, the first exercise, the next step in Patanjali is going to be pratyahara. And pratyahara is when you are, the image that's often given is the turtle who's drawing in his limbs and his head. So
Right.
it's sort of like the image of just letting go of all those external stimulations and things, the things that you're busy with, your stresses and all of that, and just looking inside and being like, well, how am I doing in here? Like it's like a little check-in, like, how am I feeling? How am I doing in here? Is my life working for me? Am I, do I feel really engaged and connected and part of my life or not? It's a good opportunity to tune out all the attractions your eyes might want to watch, all the beautiful sounds your ears might want to hear, the delicious tastes your tongue might want, or the smells, or whatever, the touch of a partner. It's sort of taking those, saying, those things are still there and I'm still going to enjoy them, but I'm going to take a moment to just let those go for a moment and see what's going on inside. And so you do that enough, and then you start to notice the mind much, much more. It's much louder whenever you've turned off the senses to the external and you start looking inside. And that can be a turnoff to some people. It gets chattery. There's a lot of stuff going on. It can stress you. It can, but hopefully you're recognizing like, oh, this is how my mind is treating me all the time.
Right.
It's pulling me around like a dog on a leash. And maybe that's not the most healthy way or the nicest way to live a life.
Not most enjoyable for sure, right? Yeah.
No,
No one
absolutely
likes
not.
to be pulled around.
Yeah. And so then you would move, so you spend time in pratyahara and you start to notice like, oh, there's this chaos of conditionings and feelings and all kinds of stuff swirling and going on inside of you. And it's like, all right, well, how do I deal with that now? How do I explore that even deeper? And so you would come to the conclusion that okay, well, I need to have a certain level of concentration so that my mind and the sensations in my body aren't constantly taking my attention away from its task to understand what's going on and getting them caught up in the little theaters that are happening. So that would be dharana, that would be these concentration types of practices. In the Buddhist tradition of vipassana, you're taking the attention, you're focusing it just on the ring of the nostril, just to feel the difference in temperature as the breath goes in and out, and the touch of it on the inner hairs of your nose. And it seems silly, but the idea is that you're sharpening your concentration like a knife to where it becomes so solid and so one-pointed that whatever you put your attention on, you can sustain that attention there and to the point of understanding, right? So then with that dharana now and that whole inner world, mental, physical world, all of the stuff that you progressed up from the yamas and niyamas to at that point, is starting to clear itself out because the attention is able to stay focused long enough to grasp what's going on instead of being drawn away into distractions and different things. So once that level is attained, that's what you call meditation, the dhyana, which would be the next stage in Patanjali's treatise. And in dhyana, you're basically you've got the concentration to remain completely present with your inner reality and the reality of your body and everything. You're able to remain completely present without resorting to fantasy or flight or postponements or whatever. You're able to stay focused. You're not just talking to yourself in your head about how your shoulder blades are burning or how your legs fell asleep or whatever it is. That's not a concern anymore because you've mastered those impulses. And so once that mastery takes place within meditation, all of those understandings arise out of the conditions that you've created. The conditions are ripe to allow for the seeing, to allow for the awareness of what that really all is. And at that particular moment of understanding, you reach samadhi. And samadhi is often synonymous with moksha, and has a lot to do with liberation. You become a truly free person, free from your biological impulses, free from all of the mental games that you play, and free from the necessity to feel pleasure in your body constantly. It's develops into a natural equipoise. And if you try to force that, you're going to end up with indifference because you're going to try to stay neutral, and it means you're going to dampen all your feelings down. You're not going to really experience what's going on, but you'll be a nice flat line,
Right.
so to speak. But that's not the point. The point is to be able to experience fully and remain present without distraction and without fantasy, because within that capacity is an insanely beautiful moment of perception of what life is, what spirituality is, what all those things are. And it tends to be a self-correcting understanding. And Patanjali in his treatise over his 4 books is basically laying out the substrate of that.
Magnificent. It's a lot. It's a lot to unpack there, and
Yeah.
I think it's a
That's why
good.
we need a whole season.
Yeah, right. And I think we're gonna take that as a great segue into the next episode, which will
I'd,
be
I'd,
on the yamas.
yeah,
And
I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about what we've talked about today too. Like, I mean,
absolutely.
being that you're like, you're in yoga school and you're kind of learning these things right now. Do you feel like these kinds of topics are being touched on in that way, or
Yeah,
what has been your experience?
I think that it's like I mentioned a little bit at the beginning. It's difficult in an online atmosphere with that, and I took a curriculum that was kind of tailored toward independent study. So pretty much on my own. So with that, it just seems to be a little overwhelming. Just the sheer volume of information that I'm having to ingest. But I don't think that they've, done it really any injustice. I think that they've gone over the sutras and the Vedas and Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, um, and they've presented a pretty good foundation. But
Hmm.
it's definitely seemingly more focused on the poses, on the asanas. But there is some stuff there about the roots that I've had to learn and enjoyed learning. That's probably the most enjoyable part is learning about the philosophies and uh and the different kinds of yogas. Like, related to what you were saying about, a lot of people like not knowing which yoga would be for them, because there's so many to choose from. And so I think, I've utilized some of the online stuff like Insight Timer and YouTube to be able to check out different kinds of yoga, and listen to different teachers, and so it's given me kind of a good broad um, experience so far. But I think I don't know how it's pronounced. Is it the Inyani
Uh,
Janani
yeah, yeah, Jnani. Yeah,
Yan
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yoga?
yeah.
That one seems to be like very intriguing to me. Like
Yeah.
it seems really cool. It's more the philosophy.
Yeah, it's you would say like a lot of texts would say there are like sort of four traditional yogas: karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, and sort of raja yoga. But it's not a term that's actually in the Bhagavad Gita. But uh, karma yoga would be the yoga of action. It usually has a lot to do with selfless service. Bhakti is the yoga of devotion. So a bhakti yogi might be singing all day, you know,
Yeah,
or might be praying all day. You might never see them in a pose, or they might be doing poses, you know.
right.
Jnana yogi would be somebody like Ramana Maharishi, would be like Papaji or the modern teacher Muji.
Yeah,
There's
that's
some
probably why
definitely
I like
some
it.
Vedantic, monistic um, elements to those ideas.
Hmm.
Um, it's often called the direct path. So we'll definitely touch on that at some point in some of the seasons. It's a
Absolutely.
it's a very very interesting series of techniques.
I appreciate you sharing your vast wealth of knowledge and experience on the topic. And I look forward to talking to you again next week on the Yamas.
Yeah, I look forward to it too.
All right. I hope everyone has enjoyed themselves and hope they have a great rest of your afternoon or evening wherever you're at.
And don't forget to like and subscribe and share the podcast with anyone who's interested in just a real and honest and normal discussion about yoga.
Very good point. Thank you for including that. And we're actually up on Apple Podcasts now. So we're even easier to find than before. But yeah, we'll have links in the description. All right. Thanks again. You guys take care.